The 1961 to 62 Dodge Lancer, a car that, well, it has that face, as people would say, only a mother could love, but not just a face, an overall body style that only a mother could love. This has to be one of the most oddly styled, homely-looking vehicles that was ever produced, certainly by the Chrysler Corporation, and maybe, well, of all time, at least in terms of American vehicles. It's amazing to think that Virgil Exner, the individual who led Chrysler styling and really was the force behind the forward-look Chryslers of 1957, decided to come out with something that looked like this. Now, the Dodge Lancer that we're going to talk about was around for just two model years, 1961 and 1962, and most people know that it was really just a warmed-over version of a Plymouth Valiant, but that's really not the entire story to the Dodge Lancer. Let's first talk a little bit about what was happening during this time frame in the American auto industry, because there were a lot of compact cars that were being introduced during this time frame. Take, for example, not only this Lancer and Valiant at Chrysler Corporation, but over at General Motors, there was, of course, the Corvair, the F-85, the Buick Special, the Pontiac Tempest, and over at Ford Motor Company, there was the Falcon and its various derivatives. So why were auto companies introducing all these compact cars at this time frame? Well, you have to remember that 1955 was really the largest year for the U.S. auto industry up until that point. And then it went through a bit of, let's say, some challenging years as the U.S. economy hit a recession in the late 1950s, and you saw the failure of some mid-price makes not shortly thereafter, including Edsel as well as DeSoto after the 1961 model year. And with that recession, customers were becoming more cost-conscious, not only about the acquisition cost of their vehicles, but also about the operating cost over the long run. Some people wanted cars that were smaller and had smaller engines. They just felt that cars were growing too large. For instance, the 1959 Chevrolet was 4 inches longer in wheelbase than the 1955 version and 15 inches longer in overall length. Cars, people thought, were starting to just get too big. By the way, that Chevrolet, the 59, was also 6 inches wider than the 1955 Chevrolet. So imagine, over the course of just a few model years, you got cars that were significantly larger and wider, and that was occurring just as the economy was going into a recession. Of course, we also can't forget about the fact that the imports were starting to make headway, most notably Volkswagen. And so the domestic companies didn't want to cede that market share to foreign automakers, and thus they introduced cars like the Valiant and the Lancer. Even American Motors was in on this, as they had in the late 1950s the Rambler American that was just a warmed-over version of the 1955 Nash, in effect. Now, Dodge wasn't the first to take a more base-level compact and try to push it upmarket. That would really be Ford, who, ahead of General Motors as well as Chrysler, introduced the Mercury Comet in March of 1960. It would take a little bit longer for GM to get its so-called senior compacts from Buick, Olds, and Pontiac into the marketplace. And as I said, this Dodge Lancer came out for the 1961 model year. So it wasn't the first mover in the more luxurious, let's call it, compact car space. And I think it was really in this context that Chrysler decided that it needed an offering beyond the Valiant to bring to consumers, because they had originally thought that it really was going to be a value-conscious customer that was going to fall in love with the Valiant, as an example. And I don't think they fully realized that there were going to be so many compact cars on the market. Like I said, this wasn't just going to be about the Valiant in conjunction with the Corvair and the Falcon, i.e. the low-price 3, competing amongst themselves. It was the Mercury Comet now, as well as the F-85 from Oldsmobile, the Tempest from Pontiac, the Special from Buick. Ford would soon have the Fairlane and the Mercury Meteor coming to the party in 1962. So this compact class was really getting quite crowded. And I think the original philosophy from Chrysler when they were designing the Valiant was that they wanted it to be unmistakable, that nobody would mistake the Valiant for anything else on the road. And as a result, the car would have to be judged on its merits as opposed to being a car that looked like it was kind of a copy or a scale version, if you will, of a full-size automobile. Kind of a strange philosophy. It's never all that bad to trickle down your styling from the upper end to the lower end of the range, but hey, Chrysler wanted something wonky, and that's what they decided to do. Now, how did it come about that the dealer network ended up getting this Dodge Lancer to sell for the 1961 and 1962 model year? Well, that's an interesting story unto itself. I think part of the reason here was the dealer network, and that's a factor that many people forget about when selling cars, that it's not necessarily that the automaker wants to do something or feels that it's right, but that the dealer body really is just clamoring for a vehicle, and they have to come up with something that's kind of a half-hearted attempt to appease the dealers, because if the dealers aren't happy, well, then they're not selling cars. So one of the things that was happening during this time frame was that Chrysler was trying to separate Plymouth dealers and have them stand on their own. To this point, they were really dueled with other brands in the Chrysler house, like Dodge and DeSoto and Chrysler. So you'd see a Chrysler Plymouth dealer, for instance, or a Dodge Plymouth dealer. But at this point, Chrysler was really trying to develop separate Plymouth dealerships and standalone Dodge dealerships. So you often saw a Plymouth dealer, a Dodge dealer, or a Chrysler Plymouth dealer. And the Dodge dealers that now were also standalone had to sell and wanted to sell a compact vehicle in order to really keep up their volume. And thus, you get the Lancer introduced one model year after the Valiant. And despite the love it or hate it styling, there were some kind of trend-setting elements that occurred on this Dodge Lancer as well as the Plymouth Valiant for the time. It's one of the first, let's call it standard cars, not sports cars, but kind of a standard family vehicle that had this long hood, short deck proportion and had a fastback out back. That was just extremely rare for the time frame. And up to that point, most cars had really that three-box design with a hood, a midsection, and a trunk. And the hood and the trunk were almost in equal proportion to one another. Think like the 1955 Chevrolet, for instance. But the Lancer and Valiant, and as you can see on this particular Lancer, had this relatively short rear portion with that fastback design. And so it did look very different from what was on the road up to that point. And I have to say that while it appears the Lancer is just a badge-engineered version of the Valiant because they're both kind of pudgy and doughy and homely looking, it's not at all. In fact, really the only sheet metal that the vehicles share are the roof panels on the sedans as well as the wagons and the rear door on the four-door vehicles. And that's about it. It's just kind of the roof panel and the rear doors on the four-door models. Aside from that, the Lancer got an all-new hood, front bumper, grille, front doors, at least the outers, and rear quarters, trunk lid, etc. So a very expensive redo of the Valiant's exterior sheet metal. Now, there is an interesting thing and design trick that you can see when it comes to the Lancer styling versus the Valiant. Remember that I said that the rear doors on the four-door vehicles were the same. So how did stylists kind of, let's say, match up that different front end to what was the same rear door? Well, notice that the Lancer has this kind of surface that goes from the front of the vehicle partway through the front door, and then it has this hook to it, so it terminates on the front door. It doesn't carry into the rear door. Well, that means that Chrysler could then use the rear doors, like I said before. In terms of trims, the Lancer came in a base level trim called the 170 and an up-level trim called the 770. I'm not quite sure why there were no numbers in between or why they decided to pick 170 and 770, but they did. The 170s didn't have any of the body side trim, but the 770s had a lot of bright moldings across the car, and they both did spell out Lancer on the door, but the 770 had a little emblem that came ahead of the Lancer name. So that's one of the ways to spot the 770 versus the 170. And you could get the 170 in two-door and four-door sedan and four-door wagon forms. In 1961, there were 25,000 of those 170s produced. The 770 you could get in a, well, interesting, kind of handsome hardtop coupe, a sports coupe two-door sedan, a four-door sedan, and a four-door wagon. In 1961, total Lancer 770 sales hit 49,000. And overall, in 1961, the Dodge Lancer sold kind of a disappointing 75,000 units. And why do I say disappointing? Well, because at the time, that 75,000 units was about equivalent to what Olds sold of the F-85s. They sold about 76,000. Buick sold 87,000 Specials. Pontiac sold 101,000 Tempests. And Mercury sold almost 200,000 Comets. So when it came to the performance of these medium-priced compacts, the Lancer was dead last. And it's pretty unfortunate that that was the case, but such is life. And in 1962, Dodge would sell just 64,000 of these Lancers. So didn't get better 1 year later. Now, the interior of the Lancer was also an interesting place to be. Notice that Chrysler stylists had pushed the dash and the IP all the way forward, and that gave you a sense of roominess in the interior because the instrument panel isn't this huge thing. And you did get a full complement of gauges, a temperature gauge, an alternator gauge. By the way, there were alternators under hood in the Dodge Lancer, not generators. At this point, Chrysler was pretty early in adopting alternators. And of course, you got a fuel gauge as well as a round speedometer. Really wasn't all that bad of a place to be, especially when you consider the base price on these vehicles, which was just under $2,000 for the 170 two-door sedan. That was the cheapest model in 1961. And the most expensive model was the four-door wagon, the 770 trim, that retailed for $2,449. So I would say the base price of around $2,000, that would be equivalent to about $21,000 today. So these were not expensive cars by any stretch of the imagination, but they weren't quite low price. You know, the Plymouth pricing equivalent would have been sub $20,000 or right around that. There's $25 difference between these, or about $250, I guess. So there wasn't all that much daylight between the Dodge and the Plymouth, but you did get a little bit there. And, well, as a result, you got some extra trim on your Lancer in addition to all that sheet metal that I discussed. Now, under hood in your Lancer, you got an early version of Chrysler's so-called Tower of Power. I don't know why I ever got that nickname. None of these engines were all that powerful, but well, we'll call it that. The Slant 6 engine, and it was Chrysler's first ever overhead valve six-cylinder engine. It was introduced in 1960, and now it made its way into the Dodge Dart. And there were two, well, let's kind of call it 2.5 versions of the Slant 6 available in the Lancer. There was a 170 cubic inch so-called LG, or low block, six-cylinder engine that made 101 horsepower. And then there was a 225 cubic inch RG, or raised block, Slant 6-cylinder engine that made 145 horsepower. Now, some of these Slant 6s, the 225s, were actually aluminum block engines. And this was a strange time. You know, a lot of the automakers were trying out different aluminum block engines. And like I said, this wasn't the only one. General Motors in the Oldsmobile as well as the Buick had a standard 215 cubic inch aluminum V8 engine, and that was standard in the 1961 model year. Pontiac had it as an option in the Tempest. And even American Motors had aluminum block six-cylinder engines. Now, unfortunately, the aluminum block would really just last a few model years through the 1963 model year. And I guess it proved challenging for Chrysler to switch back and forth. These were made on the same machining line between the cast iron and aluminum engines, so they had to switch back and forth, and they couldn't quite get the quality to the same level as the cast iron engine, and it didn't make any more horsepower. So it's kind of hard to sell the customer on an aluminum block engine when it really doesn't do anything aside from save weight, which is good. And these did save weight. It saved about 65 pounds versus a comparable cast iron Slant 6. But again, that's a pretty hard sell for a customer when there's not any more power. And I think that was probably a main reason why the aluminum block Slant 6 went away after the 1963 model year. In any case, the Slant 6, particularly the cast iron one, was viewed as bulletproof from inception all the way through till its waning years. And it was used in passenger cars from 1960 to 1983, in light trucks through 1987. and it was even used in Mexico longer than that. So it really just had a sterling reputation for being a great, reliable engine. And the funny part about it, because they have mechanical lifters through the 1981 model year, they all kind of have this little ticking because often people haven't adjusted the valves all that often, but they just run forever and ever and ever. And I think it was a great engine for the Lancer, and customers were in general happy. So that's the story of the homely looking 1961 to 1962 Dodge Lancer. I hope you enjoyed it. Kind of a strange vehicle overall, but a cool one, and one really you don't see anymore, probably because they were prone to rust like other compacts at the time. They were unibody vehicles. They did have torsion bar front suspension, which Chrysler always loved during this time frame. But if you see one, take a picture because there aren't many left. Thanks again for watching.